Los Angeles was supposed to be the city of endless sunshine, but in the early 1970s, something in the air felt heavier. Almost everyone sensed it. Even if no one said it out loud, the city still looked the same from a distance. Palm trees lined wide boulevards. The ocean reflected the light the way postcards promised it would. Cars moved endlessly along the freeways, chrome flashing under the sun. Yet beneath that familiar image, Los Angeles was quietly changing in ways most people didn't yet have words for. What happens when a city keeps smiling while something inside it begins to crack? In 1970, Los Angeles was already enormous, but it didn't feel complete. It felt unfinished, stretched too far, pulled in too many directions at once. Millions of people lived side by side, yet rarely together. Neighborhoods blended into one another without truly connecting. People arrived with expectations shaped by movies, magazines, and television, and stayed long enough to realize reality moved at a different pace. How long can a dream survive once it becomes routine? Mornings began with the sound of traffic before the sun fully rose. Engines hummed, tires hissed against pavement, and radios carried voices that felt oddly distant, even when they were familiar. Smog hovered above the skyline, softening the edges of buildings and tinting the light a muted gray. Some days, the air smelled faintly of gasoline and hot asphalt, especially by mid-afternoon. People noticed it but rarely mentioned it. When did discomfort become something everyone simply accepted? Downtown no longer felt like a center. It felt like a place people passed through. Office workers moved quickly, eyes forward, lunch bags in hand. Storefronts opened and closed with little ceremony. Bus stops filled with quiet waiting. Conversations kept low or abandoned altogether. The city moved constantly, yet emotional stillness seemed to settle over it. Could a place this loud also be this silent? Los Angeles in the 1970s wasn't defined by one single story. It was defined by fragments. A factory worker finishing a night shift. As a film extra headed home disappointed after another audition. A family packing into a small apartment while a new housing development expanded miles away. Teenagers walking to school past billboards promising success, beauty, and escape. Everyone shared the same streets, but not the same future. How do people move forward when they don't agree on where forward actually is? At street level, life unfolded in small, repetitive moments. Grocery stores buzzed under fluorescent lights. Laundromats filled with the sound of spinning machines and muted conversations. Coffee steamed from paper cups as people stood alone, staring through windows rather than at each other. These weren't scenes of chaos. They were scenes of quiet endurance. And endurance over time leaves its mark. What happens to a city when surviving becomes more important than dreaming? Los Angeles had always sold possibility, but by the early 70s, possibility felt conditional. It depended on timing, luck, connections, things that remained invisible to most people living there. For every success story, there were thousands that stalled without explanation. People learned not to ask too many questions. Disappointment became private, carried home and left unspoken at dinner tables. How many untold stories can a city absorb before they begin to shape it? The freeways told their own story. Endless concrete arteries carried millions each day, separating work from home, dreams from reality. Inside cars, people sat alone, hands on steering wheels, eyes fixed ahead. The radio filled the silence. News reports, music, advertisements promising a better version of life just one purchase away. Yet traffic moved slowly, sometimes not at all. In those moments, surrounded by strangers but isolated completely, what were people really thinking about? There was no single moment when things went wrong. That was the unsettling part. Nothing collapsed overnight. Nothing exploded into chaos. Instead, tension accumulated quietly, like heat trapped beneath the surface. People felt it in shorter tempers, in longer silences, in the way neighbors stopped knocking on each other's doors. Was this just growth or something else entirely? At night, the city changed tone but not pace. Neon signs flickered on. Streets glowed orange under overhead lights. The ocean breeze carried cool air inland, but it couldn't fully clear the sky. Some neighborhoods grew quieter, others more restless. Sirens echoed in the distance, never close enough to explain, never far enough to ignore. How do you sleep in a city that never fully settles? Los Angeles in the 1970s was not yet looking backward. It was still convinced it was moving forward. Even when the direction felt uncertain, people told themselves this was temporary, a phase, a transition, the price of becoming something greater. But beneath that belief was a subtle fear. What if this wasn't a phase at all? What if this was simply what the city had become? Children sensed it without understanding it. Adults carried it without naming it. The city breathed it in every day, along with dust, exhaust, and unspoken expectations. This wasn't a story about disaster or collapse. It was a story about pressure. Slow, invisible, and constant. And pressure, when left unacknowledged, always changes shape. The only question was how. Because while Los Angeles still looked like the city of dreams, the streets were about to tell a very different story. Los Angeles didn't suddenly become overwhelming. It grew that way piece by piece, mile by mile. And by the early 1970s, the city was struggling to recognize itself. From above, Los Angeles looked endless. Blocks repeated themselves until they blurred together, interrupted only by freeways cutting sharp lines through neighborhoods. Suburbs pushed farther outward every year, swallowing open land and redefining what it meant to live in the city. People didn't move closer together. They moved farther apart. When distance becomes normal, what happens to connection? Houses appeared almost overnight at the city's edges. Identical streets, identical lawns, identical promises of stability. For some families, this expansion felt like progress. For others, it felt like exile. Jobs, schools, and social life were suddenly tied to long commutes and careful planning. Time itself became fragmented. How do you build a community when everyone is always on their way somewhere else? Inside the city, density told a different story. Apartments filled quickly. Multiple families shared small spaces. Privacy became a luxury few could afford. Hallways echoed with footsteps at all hours, yet neighbors rarely exchanged more than a nod. The walls were thin, but emotional distance remained thick. How close can people live without ever truly knowing one another? The infrastructure struggled to keep up. Roads were always under construction, yet traffic only grew worse. Buses ran late. Trains felt like an afterthought. The sound of engines never fully faded day or night. On hot afternoons, the air shimmered above the pavement, carrying the smell of oil and dust. People learned to plan their lives around congestion. When movement becomes a daily obstacle, does patience slowly disappear? Los Angeles wasn't built around walking or gathering. It was built around moving through. Parks existed, but they often felt disconnected from daily life. Public spaces were something you passed by, not something you lingered in. Conversations happened in cars, not on sidewalks. The city's design encouraged isolation without ever announcing it. Was this accidental or intentional? As neighborhoods expanded outward, the idea of a shared identity weakened. East, west, valley, south. Each area developed its own rhythm, its own anxieties, its own unwritten rules. Crossing from one part of the city to another could feel like entering a different world entirely. People spoke about places they rarely visited with confidence they hadn't earned. What does it mean when a city exists as many separate realities? Smog became a quiet symbol of the city's growth. Some mornings the skyline disappeared behind a grey veil. The sun rose, but its light arrived softened, filtered through pollution and heat. Breathing felt heavier on certain days, especially for children and the elderly. It was an inconvenience, then a concern, and eventually just part of life. At what point does adaptation turn into resignation? Schools grew crowded, classrooms filled with students whose families had arrived from different states, different countries, different expectations. Teachers tried to keep up, but resources stretched thin. Children learned early that attention was limited and competition unavoidable. In a city built on opportunity, why did so many people feel replaceable? Retail strips and shopping centers multiplied, promising convenience and normalcy. Fluorescent lights hummed above polished floors. Background music played softly as shoppers moved from aisle to aisle. These places offered predictability, even comfort, but rarely connection. People shared space without sharing experience. Could routine really replace belonging? Los Angeles was becoming a city defined by scale rather than intimacy. Bigger freeways, bigger developments, bigger promises. But growth came with pressure. Pressure on systems, on families, on individuals, trying to hold their place within something that no longer felt human-sized. When a city grows beyond comprehension, how does anyone feel seen? There was no public conversation about this sense of imbalance. Newspapers reported statistics, officials spoke about progress, developers spoke about opportunity. But everyday life told a more complicated story. People felt stretched thin, both physically and emotionally. Even success required constant motion. Was this expansion actually freedom, or a new kind of confinement? By the mid-1970s, Los Angeles had become too large to experience as a whole. It existed in fragments, connected by roads, but divided by experience. People learned their own small sections well and ignored the rest. The city functioned, but something essential was slipping away. And when connection fades, tension quietly takes its place, because a city that no longer holds itself together doesn't fall apart all at once. It fractures slowly, one neighborhood, one street, one silent distance at a time. Los Angeles in the 1970s believed in order. Or at least, it believed in the appearance of it. Beneath that surface, fear was learning how to stay quiet. Authority was visible everywhere, even when it wasn't directly present. Police cars rolled through neighborhoods at steady intervals. Uniforms, radios, and flashing lights were familiar sights, woven into the daily rhythm of the city. For some residents, this presence felt reassuring. For others, it felt like a warning. When the same symbol means safety to some and danger to others, whose city is it really? The Los Angeles Police Department had a reputation that reached far beyond the city limits. It represented strength, control, and discipline, but also distance. Interactions were often brief, formal, and final. People learned to choose their words carefully, or not speak at all. Silence became a strategy. How does trust survive when fear becomes part of the conversation? Neighborhoods carried invisible boundaries that weren't written on any map. Certain streets felt safe at certain times and uncertain at others. People adjusted their routes instinctively, crossing roads without quite knowing why. Parents gave instructions that sounded like caution, but were rooted in experience. Don't stay out too late. Don't talk back. Don't draw attention. How early do people learn to navigate fear? At night, these unspoken rules grew stronger. The sound of footsteps echoed longer. Doors closed faster. Windows stayed shut, even in the heat. Sirens cut through the air, never explaining themselves, leaving only questions behind. The city listened, even when it pretended not to. What kind of tension builds when danger is sensed, but never defined? For many residents, justice felt distant and impersonal. It existed in headlines and official statements, not in everyday life. Complaints went unanswered. Mistakes went unacknowledged. People learned to solve problems quietly, within their own circles or not at all. When systems stop listening, what alternatives do people create? Fear didn't always come from confrontation. Often it came from uncertainty. The rules seemed to change depending on where you lived, what you looked like, or who you knew. This unpredictability kept people alert, cautious, restrained. It shaped posture, tone of voice, even silence itself. How does a city breathe when everyone is holding something in? Children absorb this atmosphere without fully understanding it. They noticed the way adults lowered their voices when police cars passed. They noticed the sudden seriousness in conversations. They learned which questions not to ask. Fear became part of their education, long before anyone explained it. What does that do to a generation growing up in quiet caution? The media played its role too. News broadcasts focused on crime statistics and dramatic incidents, often stripped of context. Headlines created distance rather than clarity. Stories ended without resolution. Viewers were informed but not reassured. When information increases fear instead of understanding, what purpose does it serve? Despite all of this, life continued. People went to work. Children went to school. Stores opened every morning. The city functioned because it had to. But beneath that functionality was a shared awareness that something felt fragile. Order was being maintained, but not fully understood. Was stability real? Or was it simply enforced? Los Angeles didn't erupt into chaos during the 1970s. That's what made the tension so unsettling. There were no clear beginnings or endings, only an ongoing sense of unease. Fear blended into routine until it became almost invisible. And invisible forces are often the most powerful. Because fear doesn't always shout. Sometimes it just waits, shaping choices, narrowing lives, and quietly rewriting the rules of the city. Work was supposed to be the stabilizer, the thing that gave structure to days and meaning to effort. In 1970s Los Angeles, it increasingly became something else. For decades, the city had promised that hard work would lead somewhere. Factories, warehouses, offices, and service jobs formed the backbone of everyday life. People woke before sunrise, packed lunches, and stepped into routines passed down through families. But by the early 1970s, that promise felt thinner. Paychecks arrived, but they didn't stretch as far as they once had. When effort stops matching reward, what keeps people going? Industrial areas hummed with activity, yet uncertainty lingered beneath the noise. Machines clanged and belts rattled through long shifts. The air inside these buildings often felt heavy. Warm metal, oil and dust mixing into a familiar, exhausting smell. Break rooms offered brief relief, filled with quiet conversations and tired faces. People worked beside one another for years, without truly knowing each other. How do bonds form when energy is spent simply enduring the day? White-collar jobs carried their own pressures. Office buildings rose downtown and along major corridors, promising stability and upward mobility. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed softly over desks stacked with paperwork. Time was measured in hours, deadlines, and expectations that never quite stopped growing. Advancement felt possible but uncertain, often dependent on connections rather than effort. How motivating is ambition when the path forward remains unclear? For many families, survival became a careful calculation. Rent, groceries, transportation, school supplies, every expense mattered. One missed paycheck could shift everything. Couples argued quietly late at night, careful not to wake children sleeping just a few feet away. Stress settled into homes like an unwelcome guest. When worry becomes routine, does it ever truly leave? Second jobs were common. Overtime was accepted without complaint. Weekends disappeared into extra shifts or side work. Rest became something postponed rather than enjoyed. The body adapted, but the mind kept track. Fatigue showed up in shorter tempers and longer silences. How much can people give before there's nothing left to offer? Young adults felt the tension sharply. They entered the workforce expecting progress and discovered limitation instead. Entry-level positions stayed entry-level. Raises came slowly, if at all. The future felt postponed, undefined. Many questioned whether staying in Los Angeles was worth the cost. But leaving wasn't simple either. When both staying and leaving feel like risks, where do people go? Women increasingly balanced paid work with unpaid labor at home. Expectations expanded without much recognition. Days stretched from early mornings to late nights, Filled with responsibilities that rarely paused, strength became quiet and invisible. How many essential contributions go unnoticed simply because they happen behind closed doors? Despite these pressures, the city kept selling the same message. Billboards promised success. Advertisements showed smiling families and effortless comfort. Television reinforced the idea that fulfillment was just one opportunity away. The contrast between image and reality grew harder to ignore. When hope starts to feel like advertising, does it lose its power? Work no longer guaranteed security. It guaranteed endurance. People adjusted their expectations downward, focusing on stability rather than growth. Dreams didn't disappear, but they softened, reshaped into something more cautious. Survival took precedence over ambition, and survival, while necessary, can be exhausting over time. For many, this was the moment when escape began to feel tempting. Not as adventure, but as relief. Not everyone wanted more. Some simply wanted less pressure, less uncertainty, less noise, but the city wasn't ready to release its grip. Because when work becomes about survival rather than purpose, the cost isn't just economic, it's emotional. And that cost was quietly adding up. Hollywood was never far away, even for those who had nothing to do with it. In 1970s Los Angeles, it existed less as a place and more as a presence. The signs were everywhere. Billboards promising stardom, movie posters lining busy streets, magazine covers at grocery checkouts showing faces that felt both familiar and unreachable. For many residents, Hollywood wasn't something they participated in, but it was something they lived beside. What does it mean to share a city with a dream that rarely includes you? Thousands arrived each year believing proximity mattered. They rented small apartments, worked temporary jobs, and waited for opportunity to notice them. Casting calls filled rooms with quiet hope and rehearsed confidence. Most ended the same way. Polite smiles, short conversations, and no explanation. Rejection was rarely dramatic. It was routine. How many times can a dream be postponed before it starts to fade? For those watching from a distance, Hollywood created a constant comparison. Ordinary lives unfolded beneath extraordinary images. Long workdays ended with television shows depicting comfort, romance, and success. The contrast was subtle but persistent. People didn't resent it openly. They absorbed it. When aspiration becomes background noise, how deeply does it shape self-worth? Even success stories carried distance. Actors and musicians who made it often disappeared into gated neighborhoods or private worlds. Their visibility increased, but their presence faded. They became symbols rather than neighbors. The city celebrated them without truly knowing them. What kind of community forms when its heroes remain out of reach? Hollywood also shaped expectations beyond entertainment. It influenced fashion, language, and the way people imagined their futures. Young people absorbed these signals early, learning what was admired and what was ignored. Creative ambition flourished, but so did insecurity. Not everyone could be exceptional. Not everyone was meant to be seen. How do people define value in a place obsessed with visibility? For many residents, Hollywood felt like a mirror that reflected only certain faces. Talent alone wasn't enough. Timing, appearance, and connections mattered just as much, sometimes more. This created a quiet hierarchy, felt but rarely discussed. People adjusted their goals without admitting they were doing so. Is adaptation a form of wisdom or quiet surrender? Outside the studios, life continued in more ordinary terms. Set builders, costume cleaners, drivers, clerks, entire industries existed around the dream, without ever touching its spotlight. Their work supported an image that didn't reflect them. Pride mixed with detachment. When you help create a fantasy that excludes you, what do you feel? Hollywood promised transformation, but most people experienced repetition instead. Days blurred together. Auditions came and went. Conversations circled the same topics. Who knew whom? What might happen next? Hope remained, but it learned to speak softly. Too much enthusiasm felt risky. How do you protect a dream without letting it consume you? By the mid-1970s, the gap between image and reality had become part of the city's identity. Los Angeles wasn't just a place where dreams came true. It was a place where dreams were tested, delayed, and often quietly released. Not with anger, but with acceptance. And for those standing just outside the glow, watching the lights from a distance, one question lingered longer than most. What happens to the people whose stories were never meant for the screen? They understood it in tone, in silence, in what adults avoided saying. In 1970s Los Angeles, growing up meant learning to read the room early. Homes carried the weight of adult worries. Conversations lowered when children entered the room. Arguments paused and resumed later, behind closed doors. The television stayed on, filling space with sound when no one felt like talking. Kids learned to sense tension without asking questions. When silence becomes familiar, what does it teach a child about the world? Schools were crowded and uneven. Classrooms overflowed with students from different backgrounds, all carrying pieces of the city's pressure with them. Teachers tried to maintain order, but attention was limited and time always short. Some children learned quickly how to disappear into the background. Others learned how to act out just to be noticed. Which lesson lasts longer? Play still existed, but it felt different. Streets doubled as playgrounds, yet parents watched more closely than they once had. Curfews came earlier, boundaries tightened. Kids rode bikes within invisible limits, learning exactly how far was too far. Freedom wasn't gone, it was measured. How does caution shape imagination? Television played a powerful role. After school, screens flickered to life with shows full of laughter, bright colors and simple problems neatly resolved in 30 minutes. For a while, these stories offered relief, but they also created contrast. Life didn't reset each episode. Problems lingered. Adults stayed tired. What happens when fiction feels more stable than reality? Many children sensed their parents' exhaustion. They noticed the way bodies slumped after long shifts, the way patience thinned by evening. Homework was done quietly. Requests were made carefully. Love was present, but often overshadowed by stress. Kids learned independence not as empowerment, but as necessity. How early should responsibility arrive? Teenagers felt the city's fractures more sharply. They stood between childhood and adulthood, absorbing both anxiety and expectation. The future felt uncertain, yet pressure to choose a direction intensified. Guidance counselors spoke of opportunity, but examples were hard to find. Dreams competed with realism. Which voice do you listen to when both feel incomplete? Economic strain shaped childhood in subtle ways. Field trips were missed. New clothes were postponed. College felt distant, both financially and emotionally. Comparison happened quietly. Who had more? Who had less? Who seemed ahead? Shame and pride intertwined. How does scarcity rewrite self-confidence? Despite everything, resilience formed. Friendships deepened. Humor became sharper. Music, sports, and small rituals offered escape and identity. Kids built meaning from fragments. A favorite song, a shared joke, a place to sit after school. These moments didn't erase pressure, but they softened it. Can small joys carry people through heavy years? Los Angeles didn't steal childhood outright. It reshaped it. Growing up meant understanding limits early, reading between lines, sensing danger without explanation. These children would become adults shaped by quiet observation, rather than loud reassurance. They learned to adapt before they learned to hope. And in a city already stretched thin, an entire generation was growing up faster than it should have, preparing to inherit a Los Angeles still searching for balance. When the sun went down, Los Angeles didn't slow. It simply changed its rhythm. And for many in the 1970s, the night was where life truly unfolded. As daylight faded, streetlights flickered on, casting long orange reflections across asphalt. Neon signs buzzed softly, some missing letters, others blinking without urgency. The air cooled just enough to feel different on the skin. For a brief moment, the city exhaled, but it never fully relaxed. How do you rest in a place built to stay awake? Night shifts kept the city functioning. Bakers started before midnight. Hospital workers moved through quiet hallways under fluorescent light. Factory floors stayed active long after office buildings went dark. Coffee brewed endlessly. Cigarettes burned slowly between tasks. Work at night felt suspended from normal time, disconnected from the rest of the city. What kind of life forms when schedules no longer align? Taxi drivers knew Los Angeles in fragments. They memorized routes that avoided traffic even at odd hours. They listened more than they spoke, collecting half stories from passengers heading nowhere or everywhere at once. Radios crackled softly, filling gaps in conversation. The city revealed different faces after dark. More honest, more tired. What truths only surface when daylight disappears? Neighborhoods shifted at night. Some grew quieter, retreating behind locked doors and drawn curtains. Others grew restless, streets alive with movement and sound. Music drifted from open windows. Laughter mixed with tension. Sirens echoed just often enough to remain present in everyone's awareness. The night never explained itself. It only hinted. How do you measure safety when it changes by the hour? For many, nighttime offered a sense of anonymity. Faces blurred, expectations loosened. People felt less visible, and sometimes less judged. This freedom was subtle but meaningful. Yet anonymity also carried risk. Boundaries softened. Decisions felt heavier in hindsight. When no one is watching, what choices do people make? The city's infrastructure aged differently at night. Broken streetlights stayed broken longer. Empty bus stops felt exposed. Long walks felt longer. Shadows stretched across sidewalks, shaped by passing headlights. The sensory details sharpened. The hum of electricity, the echo of footsteps, the distant bark of a dog. Night magnified everything. Why does darkness make awareness feel louder? For those trying to sleep, the city refused silence. Engines roared, radios played, voices carried through thin walls. Rest came in pieces rather than stretches. Dreams were interrupted. Fatigue accumulated quietly. How do bodies recover when stillness never fully arrives? Los Angeles nights also held small rituals. Late-night diners, convenience stores glowing under harsh lights, familiar faces nodding without conversation. These places offered continuity when everything else felt unstable. They reminded people that someone else was awake, sharing the same hours. Can comfort exist without closeness? As the night wore on, the city's energy shifted again. Early workers prepared to rise, others prepared to finally rest. The cycle continued without pause. Los Angeles didn't separate day from night. It layered them, one over the other, endlessly. And as the city stayed awake, so did its problems, circling quietly, waiting for morning to begin again. By the late 1970s, Los Angeles felt tired. Not broken, not defeated, just worn down in ways that were hard to name. The decade had passed without a single defining collapse, yet pressure had accumulated everywhere. Growth hadn't slowed, but optimism had. Conversations carried a different tone now, more cautious, less certain. People still talked about the future, but with qualifiers attached. Maybe, hopefully, if things change. How does a city move forward when belief begins to hesitate? Public confidence felt thinner. Institutions still operated, but trust no longer came automatically. Decisions were questioned quietly, if at all. People learned to manage expectations rather than challenge outcomes. Stability became something to protect, not something to expand. When maintaining order becomes the goal, what happens to ambition? The physical city showed signs of strain. Infrastructure aged unevenly. Some areas received attention and investment. Others waited indefinitely. Cracked sidewalks went unrepaired. Public spaces felt neglected rather than shared. These details seemed small, but together they reshaped how people experienced daily life. At what point do minor neglects become a larger message? Economically, uncertainty lingered. Jobs existed, but security felt fragile. Families planned carefully, avoiding risks whenever possible. Major decisions were delayed. Moving, changing careers, expanding households. Life narrowed into manageable patterns. Safety replaced curiosity. Is caution always a sign of wisdom, or sometimes a response to exhaustion? The younger generation sensed the tension, even as they prepared to inherit it. Teenagers and young adults looked toward the future with mixed emotions. Opportunity still existed, but it felt harder to reach, more conditional. The path forward seemed less direct than it once had. How do you stay motivated when the map keeps changing? Media reflected this shift in mood. Stories focused on uncertainty, on challenges rather than triumphs. Optimism didn't disappear, but it shared space with doubt. The city no longer pretended everything was fine. It simply avoided saying things were wrong. Is silence a form of denial or a way of coping? Despite everything, Los Angeles didn't stop functioning. Life continued in familiar rhythms. People adapted as they always had. Small routines provided structure. Neighborhoods developed their own forms of resilience. The city bent without breaking. But bending requires energy, and energy isn't endless. How long can a city hold itself together under constant strain? There was a sense that something had to change, even if no one knew what that change would look like. The 1970s were ending, but their influence remained unresolved. Los Angeles stood at a quiet threshold, looking ahead without clarity. Was this the calm before renewal, or the pause before deeper division? The city held its breath, not waiting for disaster, but for direction. And as the decade closed, one truth became impossible to ignore. Los Angeles would not enter the next era unchanged. The 1970s didn't end with a conclusion. They faded, and Los Angeles carried their weight forward. As the city moved toward a new decade, there was no clear moment of transition. Streets looked the same. Buildings stood where they always had. People went to work, returned home, repeated familiar routines. Yet something fundamental had shifted beneath the surface. The city felt older, not in years, but in experience. What does a place remember when it never fully speaks? The pressures of the 1970s left marks that were difficult to erase. Neighborhoods had learned self-reliance out of necessity. Families had adjusted expectations. Trust had become selective. These adaptations weren't temporary. They became habits, and habits over time shape identity. How much of the future is built from coping rather than choice? Children who grew up in that decade entered adulthood with sharpened awareness. They understood limits early. They read tension quickly. Optimism came with caution attached. They didn't expect ease. They expected effort. This mindset would influence how the city moved forward, even when circumstances improved. Can a generation unlearn what survival taught them? The city's scale remained both its strength and its burden. Los Angeles continued to expand, but now with memory attached. Growth no longer felt innocent. Every new development carried echoes of what had been lost or overlooked. Progress came with hesitation. Was expansion still a promise or a reminder? Culturally, the city emerged more complex. Diversity wasn't just present, it was foundational. Different communities had weathered the decade differently, yet all had been shaped by it. Shared space didn't mean shared experience, but it created an unspoken understanding. Life here required adaptation. How does a city tell a single story when it has learned to live as many? The myth of Los Angeles survived, but it changed tone. The city of effortless dreams gave way to something more layered. Success was still possible, but it no longer felt guaranteed. The shine remained, but it was tempered by realism. Fantasy and endurance learned to coexist. Is a dream weaker once it acknowledges reality, or stronger? By the time the 1980s arrived, Los Angeles was ready for reinvention, even if it didn't know how that reinvention would unfold. The foundations had shifted. The cracks had been mapped. What came next would be shaped by everything that had been endured quietly before. The past was no longer behind the city. It was built into it. The 1970s did not define Los Angeles by what happened. They defined it by how people lived through what didn't happen. No collapse, no single turning point, just years of pressure, adaptation, and silent change. And that is why, even today, traces of that decade remain in the city's pace, its caution, its resilience. Because the Los Angeles we know now was not created in moments of spectacle, but in the long, quiet years when a city learned how to carry itself forward.